Okay, I am recording here. We are 10 minutes late.
Let's get started.
What's the broadcast?
Oh, look at the distinguished
Please
Rabbi
pass.
participant. The Rabbi
Please
gives a
pass.
class.
Thank you. Okay.
It's fine, yeah.
We are. Let's see here if I can get that angle. It more or less works.
Yeah, this is quite cozy.
It more or less works if the thing won't fall down.
What's going on back there?
Fist, I don't know.
You've been playing with your buddies. Who that?
A father of one of the girls.
If you were here this morning, then the Rabbi would have told you after davening about this event.
No, but he said mincha. He said like.
No, he said mincha followed by a meal followed by the class. That's what he said. Those were his words.
So he skipped the meal.
I already ate at home.
I had a thing.
Okay, we're starting a new chapter today, which is nice. Always a good thing. We're starting chapter 5. You have new copies. You have the Hebrew in the front and then the English, as is the normal way we do it. Even though we're on a new chapter, we are basically right in the middle of a subject, which means that we need review, as usual.
I thought we were going to get more recruits. Bring them all in here.
Anytime.
By all means.
They know everything already. That's true.
We are in the middle of an idea. We're in the middle of a subject, and let's try and review the subject as best as possible before we move on. Okay. We're still discussing the disagreement between the Rambam and the Maharal as to the nature of God, as we've repeated many, many, many times, that the Rambam believes that God is essentially, the Rambam's conception of God is essentially philosophical. He's a God that doesn't move. He's a God that doesn't do anything. Everything that takes place is the world trying to be like God, but God doesn't do anything. If God does anything, right, because we can't say that God doesn't know or that God doesn't have infinite power, isn't infinitely capable. So all of these things that God does, He does by nature of His being, not by nature of an action. And the thing that we've been discussing is knowledge. We got into this whole discussion through knowledge, but really it applies to everything. Everything that God might do, God's love, God's hatred, punishment, rewards, creation, right? It's all connected, right? And we've been speaking about it mostly in a way with regards to knowledge. The Rambam says God knows everything simply by being God in a way that we don't really understand. Simply being God means automatically that He knows everything. He knows everything by knowing Himself, which is an idea that the Rambam says we can understand. The Maharal, on the other hand, says that God essentially knows everything through an action. God does the action of knowing. Right? Why does the Rambam not say God does an action of knowing? Because if you do an action of knowing, that's a limitation on God, right? It's saying that there's God, and then there's His knowledge, then there's Him, then there's what He knows. This implies that God and His knowledge are in some way separate. This implies that there's some sort of system which includes both of them. This implies that God is not God, right? Long story short. Therefore, the Rambam said it was untenable. The Maharal breaks all the rules. The Maharal says, I don't care, God knows. How can the Maharal say that? We went through a very long explanation, but the bottom line is because the Maharal's position is based on Kabbalah, and in Kabbalah we have something called Eris and Kalim. We have something called lights and vessels, and more generally they're called Spheres or Sphirot, right? And really the Tzemach Tzedek has explained that through the idea of the Sphirot, especially as they're explained in the Kabbalah of the Arizal and the Ramak, as we referenced previously, through the concept of the spheres, we basically have a way that both the Rambam and the Maharal are right about God. That's basically, we finished explaining that last week. How are they both right about God? Because the spheres, each sphere, what's a sphere? A sphere and the spheres are the tools that God uses to create the world, or the means by which God relates to the world, right? There's 10 of them. Some of them are what we call the intellectual spheres, some are the emotional spheres, right? But these are the 10 means by which God relates to the world, according to Kabbalah. According to the Arizal and the Ramak, the spheres are made up, each sphere is made up of Ur and Kli, is made up of light and vessel. And as we've described, the light and vessel are very, very different things. The light is like the God of the Maharal. The light is unified, it's one, it's simple, it reflects a God that cannot, as the Maharal explained, cannot be described, a God who has no definition at all, right? That's what the light reflects. The vessel, on the other hand, of the sphera, so you have the light, let's say, that goes into the sphera of Chachma, and then you have the vessel of Chachma. The vessel of Chachma is not like the light. The vessel is a specific thing. The vessel is, the one of Chachma and the one of Chesed are different. There's only one light, but there's 10 spheres, right? 10 vessels. And when the light enters the vessel, the light uses the vessel to perform whatever it is that the vessel does, right? Like we explained, just like light through a stained glass window, the light takes on a certain color, right, or a certain aspect, a certain nature because of the vessel.
So the light cannot be expressed without the vessel, and the vessel cannot be expressed without the light.
I would put it slightly differently. The light cannot become a specific thing other than just godly without the vessel. That's what the vessel affects. The vessel affects that the godly light should become chachma or chesed, something with definition, something that has a wisdom or kindness, a specific thing. The vessel, in turn, alone is not alive. The vessel is a separate thing. The vessel is dead. The vessel, it's like a soul in a body, as we use the example many times. The vessel without the light is dead. It really doesn't have any life. It doesn't accomplish anything. The light is what affects the vessel. And this is explanation of what the Maharal means, and really this is Chassidus' explanation as well. We basically go with the Maharal. We say this is what it means when God knows. When we say God knows, we mean that the light is the light of God, which is completely unified and reflects Him, is unified with the vessel of knowledge in the world of Atzilus, and through the vessel, God knows the creation. Right? As we explained previously, what it means that He knows the creation is that He uses the vessel in the process of making the creation and knowing the creation are really the same process for God, according to the Maharal, we explained before. That's a side matter at the moment. And that's basically what we explained. Now, how is the Rambam right in all of this? As we finished explaining last week, when the Rambam says that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once, that God knows by knowing Himself, that is true, as is explained in the footnote in chapter 2 of Tanya, very famously, that is true in the world of Atzilus. In the world of Atzilus, if all we're talking about is the spheres, then there is this idea that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. We said that the light represents is the wrong word because it makes it sound symbolic. When I say represent, I mean more like acting attorney almost is more what I mean by represent. He's the shushvinin, he's the representative. The light in the spheres of Atzilus is the representative of God, the undefined, inexplicable, ineffable God. That is the knower. The vessel is the means by which the knower knows. And what is known, as we explained at the end of the last chapter, which is quite a mind-blowing thing, what is known is the unity of the light and the vessel. That's what is known. So you have the knower, the knowledge, and the known, all in one thing, which is the sphera, which is this thing called the sphera in Atzilus. This is all. I'm giving only the chapter headings. Obviously, this is all very involved. We've been talking about in past weeks. So the long story short, we solve the problem of how God relates to the world. We have an infinite God and we have a limited world, right? The Rambam solves the problem by saying that God doesn't really interact with the world at all. But God, and the extent to which God does relate to the world is a mystery bound up in the infinitude of His existence, right? There's no explanation. There's no God actually doing an action and relating to the world. There just is God. Right, and the world's almost is interacted with automatically, so to speak, and just simply by God being God. That's what the Rambam means by the knower, the knowledge, and the known. The Maharal, on the other hand, says that God does interact with the world through an action, But how does it work? He doesn't interact with the world directly, because if God, as we explained last week, if God interacted with the world directly, that would mean he literally has a knowledge outside of himself. Then we would have the problem of the Rambam. How could there be God and God's knowledge? That means there's not one God. Right, so it turns out that God's knowledge is part of God in the explanation of Chassidus, but not part of God like the Rambam says. It's not part of God as in God has a tool that He uses to actually know. It's not like God. It's not, as we said last week. It's not like the axe in the hands of the wood chopper, that there's a tool which exists externally to God, and God uses the tool to accomplish something. The vessels of Atzilus are also part of God. They're also godliness. They're like the light. The vessels and the light really come from the same place. And we explained, because the vessels and the light come from the same place, the light and the vessels are able to interact. So God, how does God interact with the world? How does God know the world? In conclusion, through the spheres of knowledge, in which the light of the infinite God interacts with limited and defined vessels and kalim. And the kalim are the reason why this solves anything and doesn't just move the problem of how God interacts with the world to a higher level, and we just call it kalim and dispose of it that way. The reason why this isn't just moving it to a different level is because the kalim are substantively different than the world. The kalim are not separate from God like the world is. Right? So essentially we really have four things. Four things we need to understand. There is the limited world, which is the easiest to understand, because that's the world of our daily experience. There is the infinite God. When we say infinite, I mean infinite like the Maharal. There's no words that can describe him. There's no definition that limits him or prevents him from doing anything in any way. He's completely indefinable. Between the two, you have a realm called godliness, which is neither a creation nor God. And in that realm, you have where the tire meets the road, and that where the rubber hits the road, in that realm is called the Sphira. Is in the Sphira, and in the Sphira, you have two things. You have the light and the vessel. So we have four things to understand. You have the infinite God. You have the light. The light somehow interacts with a limited vessel, which is where currently the mystery is, right? How does that work? But once you have the limited vessels, everything below the vessels, so to speak, is understood. Everything below the vessels is more or less part of the world, or at least part of the realm of the understandable. As opposed to the light, which is the light and everything that's above the light, which, as we've explained, is not known through knowledge, but is known through faith. So the light and above is known through faith. The vessel and below is known through knowledge.
But it is known to us. The fact that how God knows bugs me a little bit. You gave God some kind of limbs or body parts. Through them, He knows. It's kind of giduf. It's kind of a limitation of God.
It's what it says in Patach Eliyahu. As to why that's not the whole story, whatever. Nothing we're saying is the whole story.
Was there a threat of excommunication over the Maharal's belief?
The Rambam's belief, if anything, I think, the Rambam and his philosophy are very controversial. The thing is, but in Chassidus' understanding, they're both right. In Chassidus' understanding, the way it turns out, as I just said about faith and knowledge, the way it turns out is that historically, the Rambam's understanding of God, he limited himself to a rational understanding of the Creator, which was built up from the knowledge of the world and from logical principles, which is why you find that it's not just the Rambam who has roughly this conception of God, but many other philosophers, even from other religions in the Rambam's time, Lahavdil, had a very similar conception of God, because this is the conception of God you come to if you start from the world and you use logic, you end up in roughly the same place, right? This is the God that is knowable through the world. This is why we don't believe only Jews should believe in God. This is why it's one of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, that everyone should believe in God, because we believe it's an objective fact about reality that everyone can know. It's not like it's not something you need a special revelation. It's not part of our tradition. It's a fact about the world that's objective and knowable by everyone. So the Rambam's conception of God is as high as you can go through rationality, which is exactly what our Maimer is about. Our Maimer is trying to explain what faith is, so we've explained it at length that the Rambam's understanding of God is the highest understanding you can have, purely of knowledge, purely of working through the objective world. As opposed to the Maharal's understanding, which is more top-down. It's based on revelation. It's Kabbalah. Kabbalah is the received wisdom, the received secrets of the Torah. This is working in the other direction. This is God explaining. This is what the Torah explaining how God creates the world, and therefore you have levels and a whole reality above how far the Rambam can reach, which is true, that cannot be known through so to speak, the objective reality and pure logic. You have to have a tradition. You have to have the Torah tell you that these things are true, not just.
Let me ask you regarding the vessels. So the vessels are actually the sfirot?
The sfirot are light and vessels together. Just like a person is body and soul
Okay,
together.
so the sfirot is like the sum of the light and the vessel together.
Yeah, roughly.
And the vessels are creation of God.
Yes. The vessels are, exactly, yeah. Basically, it's more complicated. Everything is more complicated than we've said. But long story short, yes, the vessels are a creation. The light is not a creation. That's basically what we've been saying.
The light is like expression of God itself.
Yes, the light is godliness. It reflects God Himself, whatever that means. That's what we mean. The vessels, roughly speaking, yeah.
Or and Sof is the light. The thing
Yeah.
is, sfirot, do they have shapes? Because, there are different sfirots. And since the light, and the vessel creates a sphira, and each sphira has a name and definition, does the vessel have a shape?
What do you mean by shape?
It's like, it has a purpose. When God created the vessel, created it for a purpose that when the light
Sure.
comes in, it could be something.
Yeah, the vessel's not obviously not physical, but
Right.
yeah, but yes, the vessel has a I wouldn't say shape, but the vessel has definition. It has a
definition.
Yeah, it has definition. It's limited in some ways. Of course, we also say that the vessels that the spheres in Atzilus are infinite, right? Like the chesed in Atzilus is an infinite chesed, right? But there's a difference between an infinite chesed and an Ora and Sof, and a pure reflection of God's
Here's
perfection.
The question. The two
Yeah.
rabbis, fighting for the purpose of the definition of the wisdom. Now, what about
Yes.
each of those vessels and the sphirot which are created together with the light? Is that part of God? Is that separated God? Why is it separated?
That is the whole question. The question is, where does this leave us? That's the question we're basically going to Perek A with. The question is, where does this leave us? Because what we haven't explained is how you can have something like the vessels, which seem to be of the world, and like anything else, right? The vessel, ultimately, even though it's at an infinite remove, and we can't even imagine what those vessels really are, nevertheless, ultimately, they're like more or less the actual creation that with which we're familiar. They're defined and they're limited. So how can it be that something which is defined and limited can be a vessel for God's infinite light, such that the two can unite together and create a whole sphera? In other words, we haven't really explained yet. We've explained that God's knowledge of the world is not like anything the Rambam could have conceived of using pure logic. We've explained that there's a measure of faith involved because there's something called godly light, which is not a creation and reflects Him. And that is what interacts with the spheres, and that's how we say that was the answer to the question in the last chapter. How do we say that it's God that knows, right? If the knowledge exists outside of Him, if it's through a vessel, how can you say God knows, right? You should say the sphere knows, but we explain, no, it's not like that. Because of the light, it's because that the light can interact with the vessel that you can actually say that God knows. Because the vessel is nullified before the light, just like a body is nullified to the person, I've said many times, right? When I lift the coffee cup, we don't say Tzvi's hand lifted the coffee cup. We say Tzvi lifted the coffee cup. The hand is nothing, right? The hand is so bottled, is so nullified to him that it's as if it's he himself, right? So too, the vessel's in Atzilus to the light. That's why we say it's God who knows. Even though, as we've explained, it's not God Himself as He's completely removed from everything who knows. You can't even say that about God, right? According to the Maharal's understanding, which we follow, which we believe to be true. You can't say God knows. God forbid. You can't say anything about God. God doesn't do anything. God is undefined. There's no such thing, right? The light and the vessel and their unity is what it means that God knows. But since the light reflects God and is nothing other than the light of God, therefore you say it's enough. It's enough of a nullification to say that it's God who knows, not just what's happening in the spheres. Right? That's the whole idea. That's the whole accomplishment. That's the pnimius of what we're doing here. That's the inner meaning of what we're doing here. We're showing how the world is permeated by God at a very practical level. There is a limit. There is a place of limitation. The place of limitation, like in Atzilus, the spheres, the vessels of Atzilus, are limited and defined, and yet they are completely godly. It's as if it's God doing it. We say God is a chacham, God is wise, and if we can we haven't fully explained it yet. But I don't know if anyone fully. And when I say we haven't fully explained it yet, I mean maybe anyone in the world has fully explained it yet. But maybe but if God can interact with something so limited, and we can point at that and say that is still God acting, that means the whole world is so to speak open to God at an intellectual level, right? That's the whole idea. That's the whole accomplishment of this understanding, really, so to speak, at an emotional level. Aside from the fact that it's true, is that God is part of the creation, right? When you do a mitzvah, when you put on the tefillin, you believe, how could it be that the tefillin actually connects me to God, right? The tefillin is just a physical thing. Well, if you can understand how the vessels of Atzilus are connected to God, the tefillin is not such a stretch. I can explain to you the rest. If you can understand the vessels of Atzilus, then the rest, so to speak, follows relatively easily, right? The vessels of Atzilus and the light of Atzilus is the meeting point. That's where things get hairy. That if you can understand that, that's the key. Right, as I explained in a previous class, the mitzvah, the spheros in Atzilus, the Atzilus really is the Torah. Atzilus is a different word for the Torah, in a sense. Right, the Torah in its purest form and the world of Atzilus are basically synonymous. When we say that God through the Torah relates to the world, it's the same idea. God through the spheres. God looked into the Torah to create the world. God creates the world using the spheres. Right, it's the same idea. So when you put on tefillin, right, or when you do a mitzvah, or when you learn the words of Torah, all of these things is connecting to the world of Atzilus. And the question is how does the world of Atzilus connect to God? That's the question. That's the question going into chapter 5. Okay. So we're half an hour in, we can start the new chapter.
Hoping to understand the question.
Okay, we're on page 145 in the English. For people new to the pagination, it's a little weird. You start on the top right, and it just sort of goes down, and then you turn the page and you go back to the top right. It's a little weird, but you'll see how it works.
The comma, right?
No, we're in Perek Hey.
But Mahadura comma?
The one that starts Achadayin Tzarech Inyan Bir. Yeah. It'll be one of them.
Yeah. So the bottom.
Okay. Just for a little piece at the beginning. Okay. Oh yes, I decided to move on to Perek Hey instead of doing the Madura Basra of the later version of chapter 4, because the later version of chapter 4 is very difficult. This is easier for all of us.
And if this is easier, I'd like to see what that is.
You like easier? Okay, page 145. Achadayin tzarech inyan bir. The matter still requires explanation, says the Tzemach Tzedek. Ki yesh l'havin inyan hakelim. Now we have to understand, what are these vessels, these kelim to which we've been referring? How is it possible that they are literally godliness, right? Because as we explained last week, the Tzemach Tzedek keeps bouncing between these two things. He knows with the knowledge outside of him, but it's not outside of him. But it is outside of him, right? The light is not outside of him, the vessels are outside of him. But the vessels are not really outside of him, because otherwise they wouldn't be vessels, they'd be creations, right? So the vessel is not like the creation which is outside of him, the light must be part of him. But don't think for a second that the vessels are like the light, because the light is part of him, but the vessels are outside of him, right? So everyone's following. So what are these vessels that they're godliness? How are they godly and yet nevertheless are totally incommensurate to God himself and to the light as well? How can you have something which is both godly, like the godly light, and yet it is totally incommensurate to godliness? It's limited and yet it's still godly, right? That's the $1 million question for reasons I've been explaining for half an hour. Until the point where we measure the nature of the vessels compared to God himself, may he be blessed, literally like a physical creation. Which has created something from nothing, as I think Eyal just said 2 minutes ago, right? That the vessels are like something which are so far from God that they're literally like the creation. If you'll remember back in the course of explaining the Maharal's position, we explained that in the Maharal's position, the knowledge of God, the God's knowledge of the cup and the cup are the same distance from God, according to the Maharal. And really we kept that in the vessels, right? In the light is closer to God, obviously. But the vessels, right? The vessels, the limited aspect of the thing, to the extent to which God's knowledge is limited and defined in the vessels, the knowledge of God, God's knowledge of the cup and the cup are equally distant from God. The vessels are like a creation, something from nothing. And yet they're still godly. How can you have these two things together? Physical creation and the vessels of Atzilus are equidistant from God, are literally equidistant from God. They're literally as far away from him. The imkain echitachen shiyu b'chinas elokus mamish. And if they're as far away from God as the creation, how can they be godly? And to expand upon the question a little bit, so then what makes them vessels that can receive God's light instead of mere creations like everything else that exists, right? What makes the vessels special, right? It's obviously that they're godly, but how can they be godly and limited at the same time? That's the question. This is something which it seems does not make sense to the mind of man, to human intellect. Because it's two opposites together, long story short.
But if you say that if God is unlimited, if you say that he can't be limited,
if God can do anything, then God can do anything. Right. That's not called misyashev b'seichel adam.
The vessel can be
No, but this relies on the definition of the word infinite. Because
what relies?
Because they cannot be far away from God. Because if God is infinite, there's nothing which is close or far. It's all the same.
It's not all the same. The light is not far away like the Kalim are. That's the point. So really, the truth is that in order to understand even the question on Kalim, we have to understand light. Is the truth, right? That's what I'm hearing. Because you think that everything other than God is like the Kalim. The truth is there's an exception. The is not like the Kalim. The Kalim are like the rest of the creation, is what we're saying. The Kalim are like a cup and the car keys. No, absolutely. But the question you're asking, which is what's so difficult to understand, why is it a contradiction that something should be godly and limited? That indicates that we don't really understand what it means for something to be godly. If you understand what it means for something to be godly, like the when you understand it's not limited like the Kalim.
Distance from God. It's away from. And there's nothing that could be away, because if God is infinite, close and far away are actually the same. That's a
fair point. That's a fair point that has to be discussed. What do we mean by close and far? We also have to understand we have to understand something else as well. This is top of page 144 now in the left column. It was explained above that these things called kelim, these things called vessels, and God acts through them. Right, that it's through the vessel of kindness that God is kind, and the vessel of severity or judgment that God judges or is severe. Right, and as we've been explaining, the light is one. There's only one light, right? God, so to speak. The light is God-godding. There's no specific definition, so to speak. It's just an expression of what God is. Kind of like, it's like your reflection in a mirror, if you were an infinite being with no limitation. Something like that. It just is what you are. It's not an action.
Hi. Anat is asking if can do. The rabbi went home, and she's looking to do the Arvit or.
What time is it?
Minyan.
8:37.
8:37.
I think we can do like 8:50.
Well, it's 8:24, 25 is the earliest you can do it.
So
you want to do it?
She's asking, so maybe we
can do it. I can do it.
So let's please do it. So at the time disturbing, but she.
Not at all.
Keep going. I'll go.
Okay, we can do that. Sure.
Okay.
No problem.
Okay, so we will tell her.
Yeah.
It's after Tzeis? 8:25 is Tzeis?
I think so.
Okay.
I'll double check. I'm pretty sure it was 8:22 last night. So
right, so it's got to be pretty close, yeah.
Shabbat goes out 8:50.
So if anyone wants to do Ma'ariv, Barry is leading a Ma'ariv. Okay.
But can I do Sfirat Omer as well? No?
Yes.
No, it's too early.
It's not after Tzeis?
Nope.
They're davening Ma'ariv. Okay, whatever. It's not my business.
Okay, Ronnie went to get tea. Ronnie went to get tea and saw 700.
Okay. All right. We are on page 144. As I was explaining, if I can remember what I was explaining.
Oh, sorry.
It's not your fault.
Sunset's at 8:23.
Sunset's not. You need the stars coming out usually.
Seta.
Is ideal. You don't need it.
But to count the sphere,
No, to count the sphere you do. Count the Omer. To count the Sphira, we're talking about the Sphira. That's what we're talking about. The Spheras. Okay, so we're asking a second question. The first question, let's remind ourselves. The first question of the chapter is, what are these vessels, and how can you be both godly and limited? And more broadly, what is the nature of these vessels such that they can unite with the godly light and be God's knowledge? How is that possible? How can they be defined but still united with the light? What does that mean? That's the first question. The second question is, we're still in the middle of it. We said we have these things called vessels, and God performs actions through them. He's kind with the vessel of kindness. He's severe with the vessel of severity. Right? It's one light that reflects God, one infinite light. The vessel is what gives it definition, right? That he does this specific thing through it. As the verse says, wage our battle because you, God, are the mighty Redeemer, as we say in the Amidah. V'sibas kol shinui ha'ashpa is bo machmas hakelim. Oh, that was just a verse to show that God expresses might or expresses severity. That's an expression of God's gvura. Riba rivenu ki kel gel chazakata. You fight our battles for us because you are you are God the Redeemer, the mighty Redeemer. Right? That's God's gvura. That's God's severity. Okay. And the difference between all of these different things that God does, right? That sometimes He's kind to the people who do the right things, or He's kind to some people, but other people He destroys, right? For example, it seems like an important difference, right? All those differences we're saying so far, according to what we've explained, come because of the kelim, or because of the vessels. The light is one light. The light is one light, which reflects one God, right? And the vessels are what make the difference. It's when the light goes through the kli of chesed, then He's kind. When it goes to the kli of gvura, then God expresses His gvura.
Forms of hanhaga. How do you say hanhaga?
Behavior.
Not leadership. Hanhaga, like menaheg, like
how He deals with ways in which
steers the way He steers the way.
Yeah, something like that. Okay. Shem kelim shenim, and He uses different vessels for these things. That from kindness you have light and water, right? Water is a derivative of God's chesed specifically, right? The water as an element derives from God's kindness in Kabbalah. So too the sweet fruit and sweet herbs and things like that he's giving examples of things which derive from God's kindness in the creation. We have to remember a reminder that we say the 10 sfirot are the 10 building blocks of creation. So everything is made using a combination of the 10 sfirot. The example I gave when we first spoke of this concept was about the different colors, and how everything is created with different primary colors. But all the millions of different colors you have are created with a very small number of primary colors. It's the same thing with the sfiros, that all the creations that we see and all the variances we see in the world, basically what gives the world multiplicity, which gives the world differences between everything, it all comes because of the 10 spheres, the 10 vessels. But there are some things in the world which derive primarily from one thing. Just like in the whatever. No, it's a different subject. Whatever. Don't bother with that. Okay, so you have 10 sfirot, and they create everything in the creation. But some things are connected specifically to one sphere. So water is connected to the spheros HaChesed. Water comes primarily from the kindness of Atzilus. That's something that it says in the Kabbalah, and so too with many things. If you actually learn the Sifrei Kabbalah, you'll see that they've thought of just about everything you can imagine. There's tradition on what the aspects of the Kabbalah come from, colors and all different things like that. Colors, the 6 dimensions, time. It's all explained according to the spheres. Everything comes through the vessels. The vessels are what creates anything that is not one, right? This is the source of all multiplicity, of all chiluk, right? Of all the difference between between one thing and another in any way, all comes from these vessels, comes from the spheres.
And everyone was agreeing, like you said, water is chesed from Atzilus. And everybody agreed on that?
I think so, more or less. Yeah, the water is chesed and fire is gvura. Yeah, I think generally speaking that's because if you actually learn about the tochen pnimi of what water is, if you actually learn what water is really, you'll see that it's chesed. And if you learn what fire is really, you'll see that it's gvura primarily. Right, that is roughly the idea. Right, right, as opposed to God's gvura, as opposed to God's severity, comes the firmament, the rakia, and also the grasses and herbs and fruit that are more bitter come from gura or sour. And so too with all of the other spheres. The point is that all the different things, all the differences, God expressing Himself differently in each creation is because of the vessels of Atzilus. That's the point. When I move on Lamaskil Hetiv, it is thoroughly understandable to someone who understands well. It's understandable to someone who's smart and understands well. And before Gamken El Perek Dad, and we also explained it earlier in chapter 4, the intention is not that the vessels do it on their own. God forbid. Right? If the vessels do it on their own, if the vessels can go off and accomplish anything on their own, that is literally idol worship. That's totally forbidden. That the vessels.
The sakana that you pray to.
That's right. That's right. That's why. The different sidurim that focus the different sidurim that focus on praying to each one of the blessings of Shemona Esrei. Each one uses a different intention for a different sphera and things like that. And you'll see in the Sfardi sidurim usually they still do it where the different shemas havaya have different nakudas under them because each different nakuda corresponds to a different one of the spheres. Right? It's the whole thing. You pray with the intention of so to speak, with the intention towards one sphera, whatever that means. The concern is the reason why many communities don't do that. For example, why the Alter Rebbe's siddur, which is what the Tilas Hashem that we use here is based on, did not do the different nakudas and things like that, is because the concern is that if a simple person davens with spheres in mind, they'll come to the idea of idol worship, that you're praying to a certain aspect of God, God forbid, that God's chesed will really be able to help me here, that I'm accessing or using God's chesed. This is all big no. That's not strictly forbidden, and that's not the reality of the thing. The vessels do not act independently of God. God forbid. As you might, and this is how you might think of it from a superficial reading of one Kabbalist, which the Ramak quotes, right? Mashal, what's his analogy, right? In other words, the Tzemach Tzedek is here giving us an example of how a person, a simpleton who reads the Ramak, reads the language of Rav Moshe Cordovero, who's the Kabbalist who we're basically basing this whole understanding off of. If a simple person reads it, they come to the wrong conclusion, right? From what? What does this one Kabbalist say that the Ramak quotes? His analogy for the spheres is a king who commands one of his servants. When he sees a person who is proficient, is good, he's fast at doing his work, he gives him presents from his grain and from his wine. But when he sees a person who's lazy, he commands his servant to strike him or to hit him. The king himself does not help or hinder anyone. It's only by his command. And that is how God affects the world through his midas, right? This is a very dangerous analogy. This is a very imprecise analogy. I don't know if the intention here is that that's what the Makubal intended, God forbid. I think the Makubal intended it in the way that in the much higher understanding that we have. But a simple person reading the analogy will come to the conclusion that the Kalim actually have independent actions, like the servant of a king, right? Where you blame the servant, right?
Discernment.
God forbid, like in the case of the Nuremberg trials, right, where they famously said they were just following orders, right, or Eichmann said, or whatever it was, Yimach Shemeh, that he was only following orders, right, and that didn't excuse him in court, God forbid, because you follow orders, you do anything, God forbid. What kind of animal does anything just because they're ordered to do so? The Kalim, it's a similar situation here. The Kalim are not a servant following orders. They're not because the reason why you still put the Nazi to death, even though he says he was only following orders, is because he has independent free will and he's able to choose whether to follow the orders or not. Right? From the mashal, from the analogy, it seems like we're saying a similar thing about the spheres, right? But that is not the case at all. The spheres are not independent beings with their own free will, able to do whatever they wish, God forbid. Who ene mishanes puleisav. Ad kan l'shene. That God does not change his activities, and that's what this Kabbalist said, that it's only the spheres which do it on God's orders, but he himself does nothing differently. The Ramak writes about this. The that this Kabbalist thinks, the Ramak writes, that reward and punishment come from God's spheres, from the midas, from the heavenly traits, the vessels of Atzilus, because it's not appropriate to ascribe either judgment or mercy to God. Right. In other words, what the Makubal was seeking to do by saying that the spheres are like a servant is to remove God from the equation, right? Because God forbids to say that God is kind or God is strict, right? That God gives reward or God gives punishment, right? As we've explained many times before, this takes away from God's removed from the world. It takes away from the fact that He's one, and there's no divisions, and there's no parts, and there's no. You understand? It's like the same problem that caused the Rambam to say God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. Yeah. It's the same problem to say God does kindness. God does. So this Makubal was trying to move away from that by saying God doesn't do anything. He just commands the servant. Imkain nimtza lefizeh shamidas hem ha maschiros umanishus lefi tivam shehid bi behem hamatzil. If so, then what you find is that the midas, the spheres, right, are what give reward and punishment according to their nature that God emanated into them. Imkain, according to this opinion, Azav Avayas Haaretz is a very famous phrase. God has abandoned the earth. You're essentially saying that God has given the world over to His. Like the clockmaker. It's almost a, God forbid, it almost sounds like a deist view of the universe, right? That God made nature. Granted, we're talking about a very high and spiritual nature, but it's still essentially a nature in which God doesn't intervene, and He lets the world run its course. He gives the world, God gives the world into control of kindness and not kindness, and let them fight it out, right? This begins to sound very pagan, right? That's almost exactly, that's very similar to actually what pagans used to believe. Right, like the Greeks knew that there was one God who was the creator, but what was all their whole pantheon was that no, but each nature, right? You have the God of water and the God of fire. Well, why not? Right? You have lahavdil, but you have chesed and gvura, fire and water, and God gives the world over to them, and they fight it out. Right? So all of a sudden, you're literally a pagan, right? If you have this understanding of the spheres, not good at all. Literal idol worship.
Dangerous waters.
It's not literal idol worship. You be like a Greek. So, Dvarim elu hem stira ha'emunah chas v'shalom v'lei kiyumah. The Ramak writes, these words are a contradiction to the Jewish faith, and God forbid, and they are not true. They do not stand. Dvarim elu hem ubarir lanu ki hamakubal anal min hashkuim be'emunah. It is evident to us that this Makubal, this Kabbalist, is one who is full of. He was sunk. He had lots of faith. Because everyone who reads his books knows how righteous he is and how straight he is. In other words, this was a God-fearing man who said this. But he didn't have the proper wording. There was like a disconnect between his hand and his tongue to express it. Yeah, he was unable to. In other words, the Makubal was not trying, God forbid, to express something that would lead to idol worship. He just wasn't able to express the truth of what he saw. Yeah. He wasn't able to bring it down in a way that people wouldn't make the mistake. That's the bottom.
What he saw and what he wrote was two different
Exactly. Ad kan l'shoneh. That's what the Ramak writes. So remember, this is all actually, if I'm not mistaken, this is all still part of the Tzemach Tzedek's question, where this is a long question. Yeah. Rather, the explanations, that was basically a long parenthetical thing that you might, God forbid, think that God uses the vessels, and the vessels have their own will, God forbid, and all these things. Right? But Tzemach Tzedek says, rather, it's certainly, according to the Ramak, the truth is that He affects everything through the vessels. God does everything through the vessels. It's not the vessels independently. God is doing it, right? It's just the vessels that He uses. As the Ramak wrote in chapter 4 there, that a vessel is God Himself and His light interacting with vessels. And the light is invested in the vessels to achieve an end. So we find that the action is ultimately attributable directly to God. And to him it is connected. V'rak shesibas hagbalas ha'pa'ula v'sibas ha'ishtanos ba machmas hakli. It is only that the cause of the limitation of the action and the cause of of the differences between them comes from the vessel. In other words, what part of the action, when God is being kind, what part of the action is attributable to the vessel? Only, number one, its limitation, the fact that it is not an infinite action, right? If it were affected through the light, it would be an infinite action. Affected through the vessel, it expresses in a limited way. And the fact that everything is different from one another, that it's not just godliness, there's kindness, there's severity, they have a limited form. So those are basically the two things that are attributable to the vessel. Otherwise, it is God himself doing the action. Everything else about it comes from the light, which means it's a reflection of God himself. It's God himself doing it. The only thing is, what does the vessel allow him to do? It allows him to do limited things and varied things, different things. An analogy is brought on this from the life of the soul and the way it is invested in the body. That the 1 second, let me see here where this is going. Okay, yeah, let's do this. This is good. This is good.
Same energy.
Let's do this, and then we'll stop. You come bearing gifts.
That's what they gave me for the prayer.
For nuts.
It's a good payment.
Looking for peanuts is all very fine.
Okay, page 151. We're on. We're still in the middle of the question that you left on. Don't worry, it's a very long question.
I have a question though.
One second. Let me get. I just need to do one more side, and then we'll have time for questions. So she gam ken pshuta be'erech hakavas aguf. This life energy, right? The analogy that we're saying, that Tzemach Tzedek is saying, the analogy for the relationship between the light and the vessels is like the soul and the limbs of the body, the various organs and limbs of the body. The light of the soul is also simple compared to the limitations of the body. In other words, the soul, relatively speaking, everything's relative. The soul's light, relatively speaking, in other words, the life that the soul breathes into the body and through which it uses the body to achieve things, right? I move my arm. My soul is moving my arm, right? The soul's light is one. The vessels of the limbs are what give it specific expression. So one thing I'm speaking, and I'm also moving my hand. The difference between the speaking and the moving the hand comes primarily through the body. We're saying, right? Let's say that. Let's assume it's coming primarily through the differences in the body. For example, the life force of the soul, which comes through the eye, expresses itself as sight. As opposed to when it comes through the foot, then it becomes walking. Right? Then its actions are different. The action, one is an action of sight and one is an action of walking. The difference in the actions comes primarily through the differences in the physical vessels. The eye can only express the soul one way, and the foot expresses the soul in a different way. The foot cannot see and the eye cannot walk. Right? It's the differences in the physical organs, the physical limbs that give the soul the differences in the expression. However, the action does not come from the vessel, but the action comes from the soul. Right? It's still the person doing it. The person sees and the person walks. What is it that the only thing, which is the point, the only thing in the actual action that comes from the physical limb or the physical organ of the body is the differences that you see one and the other, and their limitation. The eye limits the expression of the soul to sight. The foot limits the expression of the soul to walking. And they each one according to its makeup. But it's still the person who sees and the person who walks, and the same person. It's not a different person, right? If the eye and the foot truly acted independently, you would say it's a different person that sees and a different person that walks, right? Because the eye and the foot are clearly not the same thing. But it's the eye and the foot are both vessels to one light. That's the point. So this is the same idea with the spheres. The spheres, the limitation and the definition of each expression comes from each sphera, but it's one God and one light that is affecting through each of them. Right? It's only their limitation that comes through the vessel. And we say further, it says further there, he says there that even though when the light is invested in the vessel, the light accomplishes the light acquires a form. Just like when the life force of the soul is invested in the eye, it is the life force of the soul that becomes sight, right? In other words, it's not just that the light hits the vessel and the vessel does something. The light is transformed by the vessel. The light, when it's unified with the vessel, becomes transformed into something else. The light itself changes. That in other words, when the soul is expressing itself, and it expresses itself one way through the foot and one way through the eye, all of a sudden it is the soul's expression, right? Because we said it's not the vessels on their own, can't do anything. It's the soul which is doing it, but now the expressions are different, right? It's like it's differentiated, right? It's like the difference between a stem cell, right, which can become anything, which can grow into any part of the body, and a differentiated cell, which is a specific type. You have a brain cell, an eye cell, a foot cell, right? It has a different purpose, a different shape, a different form. It's the same thing with the light of the soul. The light of the soul is undifferentiated, but when the light goes in the eye and the light goes in the foot, now it's not just that the eye and the foot are different. The expression of the soul is different in the eye and the foot, right? There's a difference. The expression of the soul becomes different. Even though it all goes back and it comes from one soul, when it is actually affected through the organ, it becomes different. There's a difference between the soul seeing and the soul. It's not like they're interchangeable. It's not like now that I have a soul energy that sees and a soul energy that walks, I can now interchange them. I could, so to speak, take the soul energy from my eye and put it in my foot, and the one from my foot and put it in my eye, and everything would be the same. That's not how it works. Because once the light is unified with the vessel, the light itself is transformed. The light becomes different. Just like the light through the stained glass window, it's the same idea.
And it's irreversible. I mean, this is...
we're not saying it's 100% irreversible, but that's roughly the idea. The point is that the light itself is affected. That's the idea. When we say the light and the vessel are unified, we don't mean that the light gives the vessel enough life force that the vessel can do the thing itself. We mean that the light and the vessel are truly unified. The light becomes like the vessel becomes like the light, they become one thing, and the light itself now has a form. The light itself acquires a form. That's the point. The imkain lefizeh. Now we're getting. I'm on top of page 150. Imkain lefizeh. If so, according to this, hadrer kashi leduchta. The question returns, the famous phrase from the Gemara. The question returns to its place. In other words, if this is after all of this exploration we've just done into the nature of the vessels, we have the same question that we started with. Its place. Duchta is place. That his essence itself will change and is affected, God forbid. And that's where we'll stop. This was the long question that Tzemach Tzedek is asking. The first question at the beginning of the chapter is, how can you have a vessel that is both limited and yet a godly expression? That's the first question of the chapter. The second question of the chapter, which it took a couple of pages of the English to get to, the second question of the chapter was really the question I was describing in my review. Which the second question is if the light is actually transformed by the vessel and they actually become one thing, and the vessel is not like a messenger that's sent by God, but it's actually the point of this last thing we were saying about the body is that the light and the vessel are actually unified. We're not saying that it's like the light. It's not like dominoes, like the light hits the vessel and the vessel does the action. God's light and the vessel actually become one. The expression of the infinite God and the vessel are actually united into one thing. They actually have a unity. And if so, the question is then, how is this not a limitation on God? How is it not a limitation on God? How is it possible that the infinite and undefinable light is not limited by the vessel that it's transformed by?
Is the limitation, though, just our perception of the limitation?
No, not how we're describing it. No, that there is an idea like that, but that's not what we're discussing at the moment. That's fair. We'll maybe get to that, but that's not what we're discussing at the moment.
How do you
No,
how do you define light?
It says in Tanya that